Welcome, Security Simplified podcast listeners. This is episode 11 of the Security Simplified podcast. Joining me is my good friend, Ryan Cloutier. Ryan, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be here, continuing our series on simplifying information security governance.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the second to last episode of this Information Security Governance Simplified series. In the last few episodes, episode 9, we talked about roles and responsibilities. That was a good discussion. Then we rolled into information security policies in the last episode. And here we pick up where we left off to talk about guidelines, standards, and procedures. So with that, let's talk about, first of all, what are these things? I think a lot of us don't know, to be honest. I've seen people use guidelines as standards and standards as guidelines and procedures, yeah, whatever, good luck. So let's start with guideline. What's a guideline?
So a guideline is kind of like guardrails. So it's a little bit looser than a policy. A policy is a mandatory must do this way, period. A guideline is going to be a little bit more, here are some ways to go about getting this done, or when doing this, these are kind of your options. So there's a little more flexibility in a guideline than in a policy. And it's I like to think of it as the house rules of the game. So if the policy is the manufacturer's rules for the game, the guideline is the house rules for the game.
Yeah, I like that. It's like tips and tricks, right? If you want to win the game, here's some ways that you can get a leg up. Guidelines are not mandatory. They are lower level than policies. They fit within the structure of policies. But basically, these are ways you could comply with the policy. You may choose another way to comply with the policy. That's your prerogative. But guideline is kind of those tips and tricks. So the next governance, document would be standards. What's a standard?
So a standard is going to be a very prescriptive document that sets the way that it should operate under all normal conditions. So that's why we refer to it as a standard. So assuming that all conditions are normal and all systems are nominal, this is the way this thing should happen. So to make that a little cleaner, for example, when building a brand new laptop, we may have a standard for how that laptop is configured. And that standard needs to be followed to a T. The policy says we configure laptops securely. The guideline says here are some of the ways in which you could do that, or some of the standards that you could use. The standard is that prescriptive, this is the way that you go about doing this. Now, not to the technical specifics a lot of times, but at that higher level. You will have antivirus. You will have updated to the latest version of the operating system. You will have done these things that haven't been accounted for in a guideline or in a policy. But it's a very rigid and prescriptive document.
Yeah, I like that. The standards are mandatory, so you don't have the option of not following a standard. That's what sets it apart differently than a guideline. And I like to think of standards as bridging the gap between a policy and a procedure, where a procedure will give you step-by-step instructions on how to accomplish specific tasks. The standard is more technology-specific. Essentially, these are the configuration items, or these are the tasks that must be completed. The step-by-step instructions for completing them, that gets left up to the procedure. Configuration standards are probably the most common. We have a standard on how we configure servers, or, what have you. So a procedure then is, I kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit. It's step-by-step instructions to complete specific mandatory tasks. Procedures are not optional. They also need to be followed to a T. What else do you have about procedures?
So procedures ideally should be as narrow in focus as possible for the task being completed. So you want to avoid having procedural documents that start spanning out into other areas of the task. You want to be very narrow focused. So, for example, a procedure for how to configure a specific manufacturer's version of an antivirus software. Right, that procedure is going to be very specific. So if I'm setting up a Symantec versus a Norton versus a, whatever, okay, XDR, MDR, AV on steroids, the specific buttons I click, how I do that, that's in that procedure document, and it should be narrow in scope. You don't want to have procedures that are cumbersome. You don't want to have procedures that span outside of their specific scope. And you don't want to try to use a procedure as also a standard. I've seen that many, many times where the standard and procedure have become blended into one monolithic document that's hard to follow and hard to update. One of the reasons you want to be very granular with procedures is procedures can change very quickly. Standards tend not to. Policies tend to be fairly static. Guidelines tend to be fairly static, but procedures can change on a dime based on a new release, based on a new vulnerability, based on a new threat vector. There could be a million reasons why that procedure needs to change. The other last piece I'll add is procedures also need to include any business components. So sometimes when we're doing an activity, there's actions for the business to take, and we need to make sure our procedural documents account for that, and it isn't just purely technology.
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, procedures are step by step, and where procedures should be made, you should have in an ideal world, if you had all the time in the world on your hands, you would create a procedure for every single repeatable thing that you do. And it needs to be written in a level of detail where somebody who has no familiarity with the system whatsoever can do it. So it really becomes an important document for resilience. Let's say that we have to do a restore of a system, for instance. Well, here's the procedure for doing that restore. Let's say that the person who normally does that restore is not available for whatever reason. They left the organization, they're out to dinner, whatever. Somebody should be able to pick up that procedure document and follow it and do what that person did. So procedures are really, really, really important for incident response. They're really, really, really important for disaster recovery, for backups and restores. So if you were to prioritize all the repeatable processes in an IT department or a security department or any department, knowing that we won't ever be able to proceduralize everything, where do I start? We'll start with the ones that are the highest priority, right? Recovering a system, if a critical system, for instance, if it's ransomware or if it's no longer available, a hardware failure. How do you switch? Put in a new hard drive, for instance, in a SAN system, whatever. Those procedure documents, you really can't have too many. It gets a little cumbersome if you have a bunch of them. Because another thing about these documents, so we talked about policy, guideline, standard, and procedure. As you go down, the documents become more sensitive, meaning if somebody who doesn't have authorization to view that document gets access to that document, a procedure will cause you more damage than a policy. It's not uncommon for us to share policies with everybody, even outside of the organization. That's probably okay. A standard, probably not. A guideline, probably not. A procedure, absolutely not. Those need to be locked down.
One thing I'll say is please avoid putting credentials in your procedure docs.
Yes.
Seen that too many times. So when you do need to do that login, the procedure should say, refer to password vault for current credential set or use the established credential. For God's sakes, please don't hard code your username and password in the procedure document. Seen that far too many times. The other thing is procedures need change management.
Yes.
So we're not going to get into the deep on that. That'll be another series we do around how to manage change. But an important thing to understand is procedures should be part of your standard change control process. And when you are making changes to technology, you should be reviewing the associated procedure to see if it's in need of an update or modification.
Right.
Because how many times have we done the upgrade and not updated the procedure doc and found out it was out of date in the middle of the disaster?
Right. Yeah. As part of your disaster recovery process, you definitely need to update all of your data flow diagrams, your network diagrams, your procedures, your disaster recovery plan, all those things are dependent upon being current with the current operating environment. So yeah, I agree with that completely. And so you kind of see how this governance starts to take shape, right? When we started in episode 7, we just talked about defining governance. What is it? And then from episode 7, we went into, okay, starting with governance, how do I align it with the mission, with the organization? How important is that? And then we went to roles and responsibilities. If you don't define roles and responsibilities, you'll never have accountability, right? There's some implied roles and responsibilities, but really being as explicit and clear as possible. That was episode 9. Episode 10, let's put it down on paper, right? Let's take all of this, put it into policy, which is approved by the highest levels of the organization. They're mandatory. And then that brings us here to episode 11. Now we've got the policies. How do we put these policies in action? The guidelines, the standards, and the procedures do that. Now, who should be approving said documents? I'm assuming that we wouldn't have the CEO or the board of directors approving a procedure.
No.
So let's talk about that.
In a well-oiled organization, procedures should be maintained and approved by the system owner. Business owner of the system should be doing the approval in partnership with the IT component of that system. So most large business systems will have a business owner who is responsible for that application stack within the business for its business function, which is then in turn supported by IT, who would execute against the specific steps. The business person isn't going to go in and add a new user or whatever it might be. But they should have that sign off because it is their system. So when we think about what we've talked about as an overarching theme of governance, which is ensuring the right level of accountability to the right activity, to the right person, I believe procedure documents are a business document to be signed off and owned by the system owner of the business, but that is done in conjunction and partnership with the IT support and security folk.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that plays off of, the roles and responsibilities that we talked about in episode 9. We talked about all personnel, all people within an organization. Once you start getting more mature in your governance model, that's certainly the time when you can start implementing things like owner. What's an owner versus what's a custodian versus what's a user, right? Those are 3 different role types that you will eventually define. Because when you do take it to that granular level about an application, for instance, well, who's responsible for the application? Ultimately, it is the CEO, but they already played their part. They created or approved the policy. Now, as we bring it down, whoever the business user is or department that is reliant upon that application, that's the owner. They're probably the one who approved the budget or got the budget or paid for it or something. And you can always tell the owner of a system, if you don't know, turn it off. If if you've got some, I don't know, I'm a little riskier than other people, but who would really suffer the most if this application was no longer here? That's probably your owner. Now, they may not know that they're the owner. So then,
Correct.
Going back to that governance and the roles and responsibilities, you need to define what the responsibilities are for an owner. And one of those responsibilities might be, and probably is, at least the approval of the procedure, if not the creation and approval of the procedure. Yeah, good point.
And that's part of pushing the risk back where it belongs, right? So you want to empower that business owner because they ultimately make that decision. Us engineers like to write procedures that we think are great, but might actually inhibit the business. We might come up with a procedure that makes for perfect security, but really terrible business function. So that's why it's very important that we're involved with them. That's why, in the old days, we set up the maintenance windows when we did, because that was least disruptive to the business. So we always have to keep that in mind when we're dealing with procedures, when we're making procedures. And for those of you that are interfacing with the business, lead with empathy, because they're going to push back because they don't yet understand. So some things Evan said in previous episodes about, how effective is your consulting? How effective are you getting buy-in? It's having those conversations to say, my job is to make sure you're as successful with this system as possible. Here's some things that I think we need to address. Let's work together, preferably over lunch. Buy them a meal. You'll get further.
Well, one of those words that people don't like, and so I think a lot of times CISOs also, or security people, need to be sort of social engineers, right? It's convincing them to take the pill when they don't want to take the pill. But the pill's good for you. It's going to, save your life, but I don't want to take the pill. So it's convincing them a lot of times that you need to take the pill. So instead of here's one trick that's worked for me many times, is instead of using the word accountable, holding you accountable, instead I'm going to say, I'm going to empower you. Well, we all want to be empowered. Yeah, I'm going to empower you. With empowerment, and I'm not going to tell you this part necessarily, with empowerment comes implied accountability. You made the decision. I empowered you to make that decision. You made it. There you go. Now you're accountable for it. So always look for those opportunities when you're talking to people, certainly when you get down to that lower level, when you're talking about things like ownership of a system. We all want to own stuff until we realize that with ownership comes a whole bunch of responsibility. What do you mean I can't drive this Ferrari at 200 miles an hour? Well, that's irresponsible. You can't.
I mean, you can for about 3 feet until you got to take it in the shop, but...
Exactly. So, yeah, great points, man. These are important documents. Now, in terms of level of importance from the top down, they're a little less important than those higher level documents until, and I'm going to preface this, until you actually need them. Then you're like, oh my gosh, how the heck do we restore this? How the heck do we configure this? That's when you're really going to be like, okay, we should have some procedures here. So,
I would argue that for every procedure you lack, add 1 day to your response.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
If not more. If not more.
And imagine like calling, so this, I mentioned incident response is a critical piece or place to have procedures. So is backups and recovery, and so is disaster recovery. Now, speaking from an incident responder who's done that for many, many years, I can't tell you how much time you waste trying to figure out what the heck you're even working with before you can even start with containment or any kind of eradication or any kind of recovery, getting the systems back up and running again. If you had good procedures and if you had shared those ahead of time with your incident responders, so they're ready, we've got a library of procedures so that when you call us, boom, we got the procedures in hand, we're following the documents. That's the most ideal. And it can, in some cases, save you 6 to 8 hours in an incident response, which can be the difference between you going out of business and staying in business, honestly.
And I'll add this as well. Be prepared that the world is moving in a direction where these things will not become as optional as they have been in the past. That getting started on this work now is going to benefit you tremendously in the next 2 to 4 years. We are seeing a shift in the industry. We are seeing a shift in what the government is expecting, what the insurance companies, what your customers and vendors. So getting this underway now, promise you, will save you tons of headache later.
Well, and think about how much better your work product is when you do something because you want to versus doing something because you've been told you have to. So Shifting your mental focus from, I have to do this, to, no, I want to do this. This is good for me. This is good for us. Your work product's going to be a heck of a lot better. Your procedure's going to be a lot more effective, and everybody ends up winning in the long run. So you have no excuses. I'm not an excuse guy. There are none. If you have assets, if you have hardware, software, data assets, you're responsible for it. Your security is not mine. I'm not responsible for your security. I'll help you as much as I can, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you.
It does, and which is a perfect segue to next week. We're going to be doing episode 12, and we're going to be talking about how to maintain effective governance. So we've taught you up to now how to get going, how to stand it up, what to be focused on, the order of operations. But once you build this thing, you got to keep it alive. Just like anything, if you own, just like a home, if you build a home and do nothing to maintain it, it doesn't take very long before that home is uninhabitable. So same thing with a governance program, right? You could build the best one in the world, but if you don't have a strategy for maintaining it over time, it'll fall apart quickly. So tune in next week. We'll be unpacking that, and that'll wrap our series. And Evan and I will figure out between now and then what the next set of series is going to be.
It'll be good, man. All right. Thanks much.
Thanks, everybody.